Hi, everyone. My name is Millie. I am the moderator for this panel called, I forget what the title, The Politics of Portraits. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathered on colonized indigenous land. The Museum of the Moving Image is located on a traditional territory of the Lenape people, and that we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and the future in our ongoing relationship with Indigenous and other peoples on Turtle Island. So I'm just going to quickly go through and introduce our panelists. We have, here is my intro. We have Ayşenur Benevento, who's going to be presenting Capturing Their Aspirations, Examining Parents' Photographs of Their Children on Social Media. Emily Stainkamp, looking back at the selfie, a survey of Western self-portraiture from antiquity to selfish, the Kim Kardashian book. And Rachel Coldicutt, who's going to be presenting The Woman's Gaze and The Robot's Gaze. And so we'll just kick it off with Ayşenur.
Hello. Okay, let me see if I can put this off first. Where'd it go? Sorry. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. So thank you for the introduction, Millie. I'm very excited about this talk today because it's my first time talking to non-academics about this topic, so I welcome any questions or feedback. The title is Capturing Their Aspirations, Examining Parents' Photographs of Their Children on Social Media. And this is a bigger the presentation today is part of the bigger project, so there will be some missing pieces. But I'm hoping to answer if you have further questions about, because I cannot present everything in 15 minutes. We're theorizing the web here, right? So we need to spend a couple of minutes on the theory, where the study is situated. So I'm using the social-cultural theory, but mainly developed by Vygotsky in the 60s, but was then taken over by many developmental psychologists. And the idea is that the culture is the means by which societies preserve their values and meanings. And we act upon these cultures using media tools. So humans don't act upon world without any mediation of any tool. So we use either language, we use words, we use sentences, or we use photographs to create meanings, and we change those meanings dynamically throughout the world. So this study is going to be stopping all these different pieces in one point in time, and then taken a snapshot of what's happening in social media. But before the social media entered our worlds, we did not just not take photographs. We took photographs of children. Parents took their children's photographs. This is not a new phenomenon. And I want everyone to remember this part throughout the presentation because, again, we are using digital tools, social media, hashtags. These are the new cultural tools that we live by, but these are not just inventions that just appeared all of a sudden. And the people who are using these cultural tools, the photographs and text, to make sense of their parenthood, are going through a challenging time, especially for women. Becoming a parent is developmentally a daunting task, and most of the time, women and parents go towards their peers to get support, and digital media or social media can provide an easiness to build these connections and build a community to get help. Sorry, I don't know what's happening there. So how does that happen? parents post a lot of photos of their children on social media. I'm pretty sure that many of you are here today in this talk right now because you're realizing that, oh yeah, my friends and my cousins are posting their children's photographs all the time, and I'm curious about this. So yes, you're not the only one that's happening. So everyone is taking their children's photographs and posting it online, not necessarily in a bad way, but the question needs to be asked, how is that happening? Before, why, and what children think. So I picked 2 hashtag cultures, and I'm going to refer them as hashtag cultures because, as I said before, culture is something that we want to preserve and promote, right? We need to promote those meanings. So these 2 cultures are going to be gravitating towards each other, and also they're going to be qualitatively distinct, but also similar to each other, just like any culture. So, for example, there's a childhood culture. There's a war childhood, there's a childhood and educational setting, childhood and health settings. So these are different cultures that are related to childhood. The way that we define childhood is different because we need to be mindful about the context that we're talking about. So these are just 2 examples just to give you an idea what they may look like at first sight. And then I'm going to zoom in and offer you a way to study this culture and also what's happening in these. So these are also simple captions. Again, I use Instagram. I don't know if I mentioned, but I used Instagram to gather these verbal and visual narratives. This fashion kid's caption says, "Guess who just woke up from their nap? This drooling baby with messy hair, LOL." Let the kids. We took the littles to a farm today to let them run wild in a corn maze, pet some goats, and so my mama could capture some family photos. Featuring Josh in Daddy Doll form. Can't wait to upload these beauties and share some more. This is again to give you an idea. We're already formulating some research questions in our mind, hopefully. And one of the research questions I asked was how the 2 digital cultures of childhood postings manifest themselves. First, I'm not going to go into detail, but finding these 2 hashtag cultures requires some process. And I've went through many, many different ones, and I picked these for various reasons. And to understand these digital contexts and their purposes, I looked at the captions, and I looked at photographs and the network structures. So I'm going to move a little fast here. On the day that I started collecting data, which is just 10 days, there were close to 5 million fashion kids posts and close to 1 million Let the Kids posts. They're not in equal numbers. Fashion kids seems to be a little bit more popular. But over time, in 1 year, I actually saw that Let the Kids has grown at a much faster pace than the fashion kids. It's not like fashion kids stopped growing, it grew, but it seems like these days Let the Kids is becoming more popular. So that all of these are gonna get together at the end. In this 10-day period that I collected data, again, there were more fashion kids photos, but interestingly, there were more photos with geotags with the Let the Kids. Maybe they wanted to identify and emphasize the place. We will see. So what happened with those geotags? This is just to give you an idea to see how if we want to compare cultures, we want to make sure that they're kind of comparable, right? So I wanted to control that. And I see that both fashion kids and Let the Kids are picked up by users overall globally. However, there are some differences. For example, fashion kids are used the first 4 countries that are mainly popular: Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, and I'm going blank here. I can't remember, but these three first. And for the Latin kids is United States, Canada, United Kingdom. So already you're just seeing some sort of an inequality there too. Keep that in mind as well. Latin kids also seem to get more likes and comments. So then I looked at captions and the networks. So after lots of data cleaning and lots of dealing with politics of Instagram, which I'm happy to talk about in another talk, because it's hard to gather data from Instagram these days. That's why one of the platforms where not lots of social research is not happening in Instagram is because of the politics. But we can discuss those later. I first looked at the most accompanied hashtags to get an idea of what are the main topics that are being visited. And as you can see, there are already some themes are emerging there, but like emphasis on the mom's use and childhood, but outfit and fashion and the fashion kids. And then I looked at what are the specific words that are appearing in the captions, and some people use sentiment analysis. I use significance analysis because I'm a narrative researcher, and here we'll see that fashion kids users are more using more appearance-related words, gender state expressions like diva, girl, babe, and socializers like good morning, hi, hello, how are you doing? So these are some of the examples. Gal, we're lot loving as positive feeling. What have you got? Engaging with the audience. And then we see, very interestingly, some other patterns, but to me the most interesting is Latin kids users are distancing themselves from the child, but also identifying some sort of a possession. So how that does happen? I love watching these two just do about anything. So these two, meaning like these two, not my babies. But then some other caption also says like my boys think mummies don't drive. Like our home, our family, my boys. So there was all these conflicting, complex use of evaluated words that are happening in these captions. So which indicates that there are more, the people, parents who are posting photos with Latin kids seem to be more invested in the network, which I also looked. Fashion kids users are mentioning each other more than Latin kids users, which could indicate, well, maybe they're using brands and other people when they're posting photos of their children. Latin kids users, in complete contrast, are replying to each other. So they are on their phone more frequently than fashion kids people. So they're more invested in actually spending time and commenting people and maybe building community. So photographs, what's happening in the photographs quickly. I look at some demographics. Most of the kids are white, female, toddler and child, that age difference is not very distinguishable. And then I looked at some values, which I call values, because in photographs, in our language, we have norms and beliefs that we live by, and in our ways of expression, either visually or verbally, we emphasize those values. So by having certain things in photographs, I hypothesize that parents are also emphasizing their values and promoting their values. So we see a lot of kids outdoor and in structured activity, which I call posing and educational setting, and they're mostly appearing alone. So let's look at some examples. In the Latin kids photos, play emerge as a big activity. In the Kids photos, there are more domestic spaces around, like a bedroom or a kitchen. So they're not really let, just so you know. But also sometimes they're also let be free. So there, again, seems to be this mixed messages happening in the Kids post. And the face is usually visible, which also has some indications. So kids' face can be developmentally tracked over time in the future, maybe. So Kids are usually taken for being photographed from behind, maybe to promote the candid childhood. And they are appearing naked or semi-naked pretty frequently, in arms with pets or animals. So there's this other thing that I want to mention, that fashion kids are mostly childified and adultified, that I call, like, they are, through the use of clothing, they are either looking super young or like very, very old. Okay, so summary and concluding. It seems like these two hashtags appear to be different cultures, and if there are two different cultures, there may be many, many different childhoods. So the way that you define childhood may be one, but most of the time we see in digital media and out in the world there are multiple childhoods, and that is intriguing for researchers because this is just giving us a way of study these cultures. But yeah, childhood is not one thing. There are many, many different ways. And implication of this is another talk and another research that needs to be presented in another conference probably. Thank you. Are we going to take the questions now or later?
We'll take questions afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry for going too long.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me see if I can. Okay. I can't get that to go away. Wait, I can't make it.
If you make it full screen,
Oh,
then it should go. Yeah.
it's I'm using Preview, not any of the PowerPoint things, because I was told to download it as a PDF.
Maybe I can turn this to view full page
Yeah.
into full screen.
Oh, great. Oh,
That didn't work.
Oh, got it. I was trying to drag it and it didn't.
I don't know where to drag.
Oh, it's on that side.
Oh, there it is.
Can you take it from there?
Thanks. Oh,
And then you can just make it.
Yeah.
oh, I have to do it.
You can use the green.
Will that work? Oh my god. I don't know how to. Wait. Okay.
Arrows.
All right. Great. Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Emily Stainkamp. I'm presenting some work that I did about the history of self-portraiture in the West. What kind of motivated this research for me is the cultural figure of the selfie and sort of the way in which the selfie seems to generate a little bit of a moral panic around it in the way that it sort of consolidates an accusation of like a technologically mediated generational narcissism among millennials. And so what I really wanted to think about was how have people represented and imaged themselves in the past, and how can we contextualize the contemporary practice of selfie taking and making sort of in a larger history. So this is going to be a very, very much a survey in this history. I can't, get into quite everything, but so in antiquity, one of the first images that we know to be a self-portrait is this relief of the sculptor Bach, an ancient Egyptian sculptor, who he's depicted here with his wife, but in the same sort of piece, he's also depicted with the pharaoh that he worked for, whose name I have forgotten, and his father, who was also a sculptor. And sort of what's important about this example is the close association between self-portraiture and political and sort of religious power from a very early point. And then my second example from antiquity has to do with sort of an apocryphal myth about the sculptor Phidias, who was, he's known for sculpting the Colossus at Rhodes of Zeus, one of the great wonders of the ancient world. He also worked on this devotional statue of Athena, which was gigantic, and he's said to have been imprisoned for including a portrait of himself and a portrait of Pericles, the statesman, on a shield that accompanied Athena and this gigantic sculptor. So he's said to have been jailed, right, for this this practice of sort of representing himself. And so sort of from a really, really early point, we can see that there's some cultural anxiety around representing the self. And so, jumping forward about 1,000 years, in the Renaissance, in the Western Renaissance, the examples of self-portraiture that we can find are from medieval manuscripts, which were sort of copied by monks and nuns in the early precursors to universities. And in these self-portraits, the way that we can tell that they are self-portraits is that their names written above the heads. You can see, I don't know if you can see, but this says Rufilus. And over here, this says Dunstan. And so what's happening in these self-portraits is that the scribes are depicting themselves at work on the manuscripts, or in St. Dunstan's case, he's depicting himself literally prostrate before Christ. So sort of the representation of the self then has to be sort of bound up in this performative piety, basically, sort of to defend against any charges that the representation of the self is excessive or blasphemous, as we saw with Phidias and Pericles. And there was also sort of a saying from Plotinus in the 3rd century, who's a historian who writes about art, and he said that artists need to work on their souls in the way that they work on their art. So there's sort of this way in which artists are afforded the cultural space to explore themselves, but even in so doing, it's very important to stay sort of within the acceptable bounds of self-representation, so as not to literally be accused of blasphemy or sort of excessive self-relation or self-representation. So jumping forward another several hundred years, you don't get all the captions. Well, so in the Renaissance, the self-portrait exploded. And so the Renaissance obviously accompanied a lot of cultural and social and economic changes in the West. You have sort of the accruing of capital in port cities, which in turn funded and sort of allowed the court culture of commissioning portraits to flourish. And so portraits during this period were typically of royals, of regents, and these were the people who were funding the portraits themselves. And I'm sorry.
Use this one.
Thank you.
Maybe be a little louder.
Great. Portraits. So there's sort of a culture of portraiture that is coming about during this period, and there's also sort of a consolidation of the status of the artist that's happening. Painting in the medieval period and sort of before had been considered a mechanical art. Painting during this period is sort of elevated to the status of a liberal art, no longer merely sort of the work of the hands, but the work of the intellect, is sort of something that's happening and sort of driving the impetus for artists to represent themselves and to explore their own images in portraiture, right? Art is being sort of elevated and painting is being elevated. And so one of the really significant sort of developments during the Renaissance and during the early modern period is that Rembrandt becomes one of the very first artists who is ever known by face during his own life. So Rembrandt painted so many portraits of himself that people knew what he looked like who didn't know him immediately, which was not, technologically a thing really before this period. And so with Rembrandt, you can really see sort of the use of painting the self to elevate the status of the artist, right? And to sort of further his own career. And I think that is extremely significant in this history. Also, sort of simultaneously, what's happening in the art world is that art academies are being established, sort of in the early modern period in Paris in 1648, in London in 1768. Art, painting is. There are sort of professors of painting who are being appointed. There's, art is sort of being consolidated, visual art, as an elevated sort of practice and form. So in early modernity, there's sort of an increased interest there's sort of a more self-aware image that emerges in self-portraiture during this period. And there's more interest in depicting the artist at work. So we see a self-portrait of someone painting. And, with this Vermeer painting as well. And there are lots of examples of this during this period. Las Meninas is another great one by Velázquez. And so there's really, there's sort of an increased reflexivity that's coming into these portraits and about sort of the process of making art. And there's an increased interest from patrons in what it means to make art. And so that kind of gives people the space to experiment with self-portraiture and to depict themselves at work on art. So obviously the next sort of great leap forward in self-portraiture in Western history has to do with photography and the invention of sort of early photographic processes in the late 1830s and 1840. This is the very first photographic self-portrait taken by Robert Cornelius. Hippolyte Bayard made this bizarre self-portrait as a drowned man because he developed a similar technology to Daguerre, of the daguerreotype, but didn't sort of get it to the public in time, so he made this portrait of himself sort of drowned in response to, his frustrated efforts to introduce various photographic technologies. And the way that photography was received in the art world during this period is that it was regarded with a lot of suspicion and sort of an attitude that photography is insufficiently intellectual, really, to be a fine art. At the same time, photographs changed the way that self-portraits could be painted and made. So we have this Lafarge painting that was painted from a photograph, and early photographic processes, this Edward Steichen self-portrait was manipulated sort of while it was developing with a brush. So there are ways in which photography and painting sort of influenced each other and literally sort of mutually constituted each other during this period. Freed from the sort of burden of literal representation in the 20th century, painting becomes more fantastic, more abstract, less literal, more fantastic, and the self sort of becomes an increased, or an area with increased interest for artists, particularly as forces like urbanization and industrialization are really changing the experience of the individual in the 20th century. Modernism is sort of, rejecting artistic conventions, but artists are still able to sort of explore these issues through self-representations during this period. And also in the 20th century, we see sort of the further development of photographic self-portraits, as with Claude Cahun, sort of exploring multiple identities in her work, Nan Goldin taking extremely sort of personal and candid photos of herself and her friends. But one of the really amazing sort of ways that photography is interacting with fine art during this period is that once photographs of Jackson Pollock in the top there are sort of used to bring interest into the way that he makes his paintings, this is sort of cited as the moment that the performative turn starts to take hold in the 20th century. And people become more interested in the process of sort of doing and performing art, and literally of performance art, as sort of another valid way of understanding fine art. And sort of with that, and I don't have any photos of performance artists, but the performative turn has a lot to do with using the body as a medium, as with people like Chris Burden or Marina Abramovic or just any of the sort of mid-century performance artists who sort of turn away from the canvas and turn their bodies into sort of the object of art and the literal material to be modified in fine art. And so where this brings us, by the end of the 20th century, is sort of means of representing the self have become vastly democratized, particularly by sort of the very early 21st century. And at the same time, the selfie and the act of taking a selfie is sort of, it's associated, so I have this example of this Time cover story from 2013, written by Joel Stein, that's sort of, you know, he's decrying millennials, but in the end, he's like, no, they're fine. But you know, in this article and in most articles that are sort of anxious about young people and the way that they represent themselves and relate to themselves, you can't avoid a discussion of Kim Kardashian, whose selfie book, Selfish, comes out on Rizzoli, an art imprint in 2014. And so basically Stein in this article says, Kim Kardashian readily admits to having no particular talent. But what I think is really interesting is that by this period in history, Kim Kardashian sort of represents a way in which the art-life distinction is being broken down by the rapid proliferation of images and sort of the wide access to producing images among the population. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was that I sort of I was reminded of this piece by Alan Kaprow, who was a performance artist in the mid-century, and he writes about art as, any activity that, art is a weaving of meaning-making activity with all or part of our lives. And so he sort of wants to think about life like art that is like life. And what I really sort of ended up seeing through history is that various sort of social structures have worked to make sure that those who are able to make self-images are sort of cordoned off from the rest of the social world and sort of protected by, you know, the elevated status of the artist or their literal monks sort of depicting themselves prostrate. But that distinction is breaking down, and I think that that has a lot to do with the way in which selfies are sort of something that makes us anxious. So, thank you.
Hello. Right. What do I do with this?
You can drag it.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I got rid of it because I'm going to go into presenter mode. So I'm just going to do that. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi. So I'm going to talk about women looking at women and the robots looking at women, and really about how the advent of the camera phone has, for the first time, kind of really following on from Emily, kind of opened up who is able. Oh, okay. Hi. No, you can't hear me at all now. Yes? Yeah? Okay. Okay, how it's opened up, who is able to take the photos, who is able to publish those. And I'm going to talk specifically about like the fashion internet, right? And the fashion internet isn't cool. It's mainstream, it's women, it's kind of loads of non-academic everyday things. And what's kind of interesting about it is it's an area that lots of men in particular aren't aware of. It's a thing they never look at, which means it never really comes up in debate about the way technology is changing the world. It's, you know, it's a thing that isn't seen and isn't given credibility. And I guess one of the reasons no one really looks at it or thinks about it is because it's about women wearing clothes. And, you know, there's a lot of history of men not being very interested in women in clothes. So it's kind of a whole other thing. In John Berger here, who was an art historian, in his the documentary Ways of Seeing, he had a whole episode episode about women in portraits, and he really situates them as a site for men. So they're only really existing until probably the 1900s in a very eroticized space. And then gaze is just a conduit, So the woman here in this Manet picture is looking at the man who is looking at her. He is, and she's only there to channel desire. Whereas kind of on Instagram, there's a new thing happening where women are creating a site for women, and they're doing kind of two pretty normal things. They're wearing makeup, and there's like a huge similarity between filtering and face tuning and makeup, and then shopping. And these are just really basic, normal, everyday things that no one is terribly interested in. And potentially this hasn't happened as a kind of act in the site of empowerment. However, in the context of the fashion generally, it's really empowering, because the fashion gaze is a man's gaze. It's, and women are only interested as kind of conduits to power and money in kind of high-end ads and editorial. The women are hardly there. They're skin and bone, and they don't have heads. All kind of amazingly, they're drawings. And so this was an ad campaign that Louis Vuitton did in 2015. And rather than choosing any of the millions of women in the world who are alive, they chose a drawing, right? And so the status of women is kind of not really clear. And there's a real disconnect between how fashion likes to look at us and how women think of themselves. This picture here I love, like loads. I think it's amazing. Because so this was at the opening of the Met Gala ball last year. Pharrell looks kind of okay. His wife looks incredible. Like this, yeah? And you never see a woman in armour, right? This is an incredibly powerful and strong image, and it's appropriate because the ball was in honour of Ray Kawakubu, whose clothes are all kind of empowering and kind of hard to get into. And then it was really tragic because actually the standout image that was syndicated everywhere was this one, which is, Bella Hadid practically naked. The designer had stitched her into the clothes. They're kind of like a corset or a chastity belt. And the original sketch, right, there are so many things about this, I think, that are extraordinary, that show how the fashion looks at the women. If you firstly look at her legs, which are meant to hold up her body, right, that isn't happening. But then there's two kind of, like, if you look, there's like a shape there, and it's really phallic. It's kind of, it's like invading her space, which is really like the kind of very traditional passive image of women. And in that context, there's actually something about the everyday Instagram that is really empowering, right? That there's kind of a little bit more authenticity here, like it's a little bit more normal than everyday, only slightly, but it's a different kind of gaze, and the big difference here is that there are lots of other women who are intimately relating to these people. So there are millions of women who are living their lives vicariously through Instagrammers and influencers and commenting on their images. And it's all like the thing that is then quite strange about it is, I think the people who are influencing are attempting to be authentic because they feel that being authentic is going to be more likable. But it's a very special kind of authentic. Like it's not really like the humdrum boringness of everyone's life. It's like slightly better. And then a thing that potentially I think wasn't anticipated is that the Instagrammers have become incredibly powerful. The top 10 influencers on Instagram reached a country like an audience equivalent to Canada last year, and they're driving a huge amount of retail. And it's like the distance the pictures are from, it's kind of like it's arm's length, right? It's the selfie stick distance. It's not quite close enough, up enough to be real, but it isn't distant enough away to be unrelatable. And I guess there's a thing in this that seems interesting to me, that like in the context of Me Too, it feels appropriate that women are creating their own space to be looking at each other, that there's a safety there, that there's a kind of insularity. And that this here is a poster for the musical that was about two giants of cosmetics. But the thing that's interesting is for years and years and years, makeup has been known as wall paint, right? It's a thing that you put on to go out and face the world. And that it isn't kind of real, it isn't natural, it's about projecting a vision of you at a selfie stick a distance. And there's a very odd thing that's happening now, which is that you're able to get makeup products that mimic the filters, right? And in the UK last year, I think there's 10% less women having procedures on their face because they're filtering instead, which that's quite weird because it means that they're actually living their lives on the screen as opposed to in real life. And it isn't really clear, is the image they have of themselves more important to how they actually appear? And that actually, it's kind of, it makes loads of sense that people are like putting on makeup to be on the internet because they're doing it elsewhere. And there's I really like this quote because it points to lots of things that women do, lots of tiny labours. And so if you've ever looked at someone putting on their makeup, standing up on the train, there's loads of things happening there, right? They and they're prepared to go through whatever is happening in order to get to that. So this all becomes kind of problematic. Oh, what's happened to my slides? I don't know. I'll just carry on while it has to think. Hang on. Oh. Okay, no. Can I get to that one? Hang on.
It's on a split.
Yeah, no, I need to go. Oh, and there, nearly there.
Maybe try and open it.
And then can I get back? This is exciting. Hang on. Yes. Okay. Slideshow. Okay. So the reason this is important is because, as I just rattle through these slides, the problem is that nobody really understands the data they're leaving behind. So the intimacy we have with our phones belies that nobody really understands the information they're giving away. And if you look at this picture, Beyonce, I mean, it's completely different to the woman in that man in the picture earlier. She's looking at us, she's active, she's owning it. However, it's still a picture on Instagram, right? And that actually power is kind of given away by the fact that ultimately it's the ultimate monetized gaze, and even though she owns this, the 11.2 million likes aren't generating any income for her, And then just quickly, we did a bit of research. I run this organisation in London, and we were looking at what people understand about the internet. And nobody understands that the gays are monetised at all. And nobody understands the value of the things they're giving away. And this all kind of leads me to end to Amazon Look, which is where, God, it's like the singularity. So how it works is that you take 2 pictures using a remote always-on camera that is in your bedroom, and it sends those off and rates them. And I'm really interested because how do I look is like a very context nuanced thing to ask. It could mean anything. It could mean anything at all. It could mean, do I look attractive? Do I look interesting? Do I look fat? Do I look tall, right? It doesn't mean, am I 82% today, right? And that the thing that Amazon is generating here, it's basically checking against the trends and influencers to give you a score. And I think this is problematic for loads of reasons. It's problematic because it's normalizing. It's problematic because it assumes everybody is interested in becoming 100%. And it does this thing where it's taking away our ability to look in the mirror, right? We don't have to look in the mirror or have a sense of self because Amazon is looking at us and it's looking at all of the other women too. And to end, I think the reason that this is problematic is because, in Lacan said that, our image in the mirror is a part of our ego. It's a part of how we understand ourselves and perform ourselves. And if Amazon is taking that on as the job, not only does that erode out the self and our consciousness, but it means that really the woman's gaze is just a precursor to the algorithmic gaze. And that's it. Thank you.
So thank you. Quick shout out to anybody who's live streaming right now. I also want to mention Anja, who couldn't be here today. She was going to present as well, but she wasn't able to be here. So hi, Anja, if you're watching. And I guess I will ask or kind of put a couple of themes maybe to guide our conversation, then we can take audience questions if there are any. But I want to ask something that is I've been interested in this idea of images both as representation and also images as possession. So specifically when we're talking about representations of the self, like an image can be a reflection of that self, but we also construct the self by collecting things and by showing people, who we are through, and especially in like a capitalist system, like our possessions, right? We buy things and we wear things that show who we are. And Ayşenur, maybe you want to begin with this, but one thing that you mentioned in your presentation was like the captions and how parents will sometimes distance themselves and in the ways that they're phrasing their captions, their children become possessions. And so I'm wondering if you guys can speak to what you think and maybe kind of elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can answer that question based on my research, because there's one part of the research that I didn't present today, but I talked to mothers and children about their opinions about these two cultures. And what I heard from mothers was that they value the photograph as artifacts, because sometimes they said, well, we didn't have enough photographs when we were growing up, so it is great. I want to provide for my child to have a documentation of their development over time. So they appear to be doing favors for their children. And that's not necessarily bad. But at the same time, they also acknowledge that this is not usually how we dress up our children. This is not usually how, like, they're not always nice and looking cute and adorable. This is just some sort of a reminder to us that, oh, this is sometimes nice. It's just like sometimes they look adorable and cute. And most of the time, it's such a stressful time that we just want to maybe emphasize those moments. So they were very candid in their answers. I'm not a parent, so that's one of the, I need to distance myself speaking from their angle, but yeah, that was their answer, so I don't know if that answers, yeah.
I mean, I can just add to that as a parent, I suppose, that actually a lot of parenting is like really boring, and sometimes you're just like reaching out for, is anybody else out there? And I think and it's like, it's boring, it's dirty, it's there's lots of love, but that I think Instagram kind of has another feature too, which is like, I'm alive.
In terms of the relationship between representation and possession, I think in the history of self-portraiture in the West, a lot of what you see is that people who are able to represent themselves have a certain amount of power and status, and portraits, sort of as a cultural artifact, are they're made to be possessed and to sort of elaborate political relationships and sort of to represent sovereignty in this way. So I think the way in which portraiture has been expanded from something that only the politically powerful or the sort of religious elite had access to something that can actually be sort of a throwaway in a lot of people's day-to-day lives, is it's a really significant shift. And I think that part of what I am working on is trying to look at how that shift has manifested in other kinds of like moments of anxiety in the culture.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to mention to the audience, if there's a moment that you want to jump into the conversation and ask a question that directly relates to what the panelists are talking about, please just raise your hand and or like call out if I can't see you. The second thing I wanted to ask you, and kind of pose this to all three panelists, is that images also derive their power from words and from the context in which they're presented. And something that you mentioned, Ayşenur, and also that you mentioned in the presentation about, I think it was medieval portraits, where you have a caption, and part of the portrait is deriving its power from the caption, from naming like what's happening. And I'm just thinking about what's happening, what I see in a lot of Instagram posts, particularly in Instagram posts where it's like attractive, young, typically white women who are posting selfies, but like being a little bit ironic or like using it as a way to like demonstrate power, even though they belong to a status or class of people that has, you know, a fair amount of power. Like, what does a caption, like, how does a caption participate in giving that image its power and also of circulating the image? I mean, any of you can answer, even though I started with Ayşenur.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question because analyzing visuals is kind of new to me. My training is analyzing narratives and textual modes of communication, and today we're living in an era where our modes of communication is definitely changing, but I'm not convinced that visual is going to take over the text. So yeah, that's a great question. That I think that both those expressions, either visual and textual expressions, are going to not always match. The ambivalence is normal. You know, we're not here as researchers or educated observants to identify those ambivalences and conflicts and tell people, hey, your text doesn't really match what you're presenting. And I think it's important to study that, but also saying from our angle to, well, it's okay. So let's identify these conflicts and try to understand more of what's happening behind the camera, behind the writing, and yeah.
I think there's an extent to which I think like captioning is one a thing, but really the function of captions and hashtags are to make things findable and readable. Mm-hmm. Like the audience, like when people post and then they have like the 3 lines and then all the hashtags underneath, right? That isn't the narrative they're offering to the observers. That's an algorithmic narrative, and it's like even if you're not seeing these things in me, I'm attributing the values, and that's a very different kind of narrative power, I think, to the kind that people have had previously, because the fact that you're able to determine how you're found is very different to determining how you're represented, I think.
Yeah, well, I think the medieval captions are some of the most interesting ones that I worked with because they sort of directly address the fact of the portrait, which you don't necessarily get a lot of in other periods of self-portraiture, I guess except the ancient ones. But what it makes me think about is sort of the way in which medieval self-portrait makers, in terms of these scribes at least, had to directly sort of counter the fact of the image that they were making by saying, I'm asking Christ for mercy, or I'm here at work on this manuscript that you're reading. And then it made me think about sort of captions that you see appended to selfies, like typically, and how there was this period where you would put GPOY under your selfie for a gratuitous picture of yourself. Does anybody remember? And I guess like a more contemporary version of that is like, I think I look cute in this, might delete later type of thing. These captions that are like used as jokes because you don't want to really admit maybe to the fact of your selfie and like of wanting to share your image or sort of what that might mean about the way that you relate to yourself, or sort of what you want out of the way that the image is going to be circulated or received or sort of projected. And I think it's just really interesting that there's sort of a parallel in medieval captioning, a self-conscious irony.
Yeah, I actually want to plug an article that I recently read in the New Inquiry by Anja Dinhopl, and it was about the connections or the failings of white feminism in like Instagram spaces where like, pictures of generally attractive white women are like taking pictures of themselves as a way to respond to the male gaze, without actually doing much. They're still the accepted paragons of beauty, and so there's like a very much a question of like race there too, like who, if this is a response to the male gaze, and if there is some sort of like irony when it's owned, like when it's like, oh, I'm actually not going to make an ironic joke of this, I'm going to take a gratuitous picture of myself, who, and I think that this was addressed in all panels, like there's definitely a sense of like there are certain people who are allowed, by status and by class and by race, who are allowed to show themselves gratuitously, without anybody questioning, like, are you being selfish? Are you being, and the title, I guess, of Kim Kardashian's book, Selfish, but like, are you being questioned basically for this representation of yourself?
There's a really interesting difference on YouTube, where you have people doing tutorials. There's like basically a whole underground movement of women doing hair and makeup tutorials. And the difference is like the level of entry isn't your attractiveness or the niceness of your house, or it's your knowledge. So it's actually much more representative, because it's people saying like this is the trick they have to do their hair, or this is expertise that they have. And there are huge, I think, quite hidden communities of people who are talking to one another and drawing on each other's expertise, but it's less performative and more community oriented.
Yeah, I just want to jump back to the medieval portraits. Like, it just makes me think of like, oh, instead of like justifying themselves to their audience, they're like, it's okay, God, like I'm like prostrating myself to you, and I'm showing everybody that, instead of like I'm just, this is a devotional portrait rather than gratuitous.
Well, and the audience would have been very small,
right,
as well for an illuminated manuscript. Is only the very few people in this culture who could read, much less have access to the manuscripts themselves. So God's judgment is more important, perhaps,
right,
in that period. But I think it's interesting that you bring up tutorial communities, because I've looked at those before, and sort of you do see a lot of sort of community sharing of knowledge, and you can see different sort of proliferation of skills and standards of beauty that are able to be shared. But there's also, like, in the last even just 2 or 3 years, been a huge, these channels get monetized really quickly, and people like can really rise to the top of those sort of worlds. And then you see it reflected back in ad campaigns for brands like Glossier, which sort of explicitly takes the aesthetics of the beauty tutorial and puts it into the makeup ad, and sort of the, even the finished product is supposed to be like, oh, if you're not good at makeup, you just wear this Glossier stuff, but it's fine, it's not so hard, we showed you how to do it. Or like Sephora runs tutorials now in its stores. So there's a really interesting way in which even sort of the community that can be formed around controlling the way you look get sort of taken right back up into the sort of monetizing, forces.
Yeah, I'm actually interested if you can speak a little more to that, because I know you ended your presentation with that. But the ways that, essentially what can be superficially assumed to be like, oh, women are reclaiming, or women of a certain status are like reclaiming their space or reclaiming the gaze, and in fact it's being directly capitalized on, or it's following very kind of clear streams of capital. I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to that.
Yeah, I mean, a thing I suppose that's most concerning about it is actually the judgment and the normalizing. And so there's an extent to which, like, the idea that there are paragons of algorithmic norms that everyone ought to be aspiring to is one kind of problem there. But I think the other issue is that it's really feeding into that fast fashion consumerist way of thinking about things. It isn't encouraging you to go back to your closet. It's not making you think it doesn't really matter. It's kind of making it easier and easier and easier to shop. And so I suppose maybe the impact of this would be different if the revenue that was generated was shared in the communities. But the thing that actually happens is there's a tiny number of influencers who are making a huge amount of money, and they're kind of drawing on the labour of the people who are their fans. Like it's actually really complicated as an economic model. And that, you know, if you're at the top of your influencing game, you can command tens of thousands of dollars for a photo. And the way that then that is changing the lives of the people who are taking the photos is then it's kind of like just a totally recursive nightmare of narcissism. Mm. You know, so like those two things, the money and the narcissism, are ultimately really coupled. However, I don't know how long the women as influencers are going to continue to be important, because algorithms are likely to come in and take over. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think something really interesting that you mentioned was like Amazon Look is not encouraging you to go back into your closet. Like it's like you pick two things you've already worn, and that sense of experimentation. Like I know that there's a lot of people who communicate, maybe not on social media or maybe not publicly, but one of the interesting things about like being able to communicate through images is that you can like send people pictures of your outfits, right? And so like that strikes me as like a sense of community building. Like there's that exchange and that relational exchange. And so the fact that Amazon Look is like both kind of born out of this, these interactions where it is kind of community based, or like when you're posting something on Instagram, you're looking for feedback, even though it may be that the communication is like not as direct as one person sending an outfit and the other person also sending an image of an outfit. But the fact that like, what ends up happening is you're talking to no one. Like you're getting it's like feedback from yourself, but also from Amazon Look with these like weird percentages, and it like takes away from the actual like fun part of I feel like getting dressed, and the reason that like a lot of people take these selfies anyway. Well,
and that the reason you're doing it is because of the lack of confidence. You're doing it because you're saying, do I look okay? And you're asking for affirmation, and it's kind of, if anything in the world is going to not give you affirmation as an individual and grow your confidence and grow your sense of yourself, it's probably Amazon, right? Amazon has an interest in repeat custom. It doesn't have an interest in your sense of self, and I think that is hugely problematic.
We have about like 8 minutes left, maybe a little less if there are audience questions. We want to make sure that people watching the live stream can hear you.
Hello. I feel like this focused pretty directly on a relationship wherein a deliberate choice was made to put on an outfit knowing it would get posted to social media, and I'm wondering if you guys can comment on the very trendy world of street fashion with the people who sort of put on an outfit hoping it will ultimately get posted to social media. Where are the differences? Where are the similarities in the gaze and in the choice of the person wearing the outfit? Thank you.
I mean, the thing that's interesting is I think that's really declining. Because the thing that, like, if you think maybe like 10 years ago, Bill Cunningham was cycling around and taking the photos, and he had a role as an arbiter and a tastemaker. And the thing that's happened now is the people who were being photographed have become the arbiters. So I think that's changing.
No. I don't have any strict fashion ideas. It's important to notice these as being educated, but also it's important to study them in a rigorous, systematic way before we judge, because, maybe I will be the devil's advocate, but sometimes individuals have their agency, and they despite they know the algorithms, despite they know that they need to boost their self-confidence, but sometimes they may still choose to post these photos because, as I was saying, that fashion is a culture. It's a tool that we all care about what we wear for one reason or the other, and some people may choose to present them. When it comes to adults, it's no problem to me, if you ask me, developmentally, because adults have their own choices and they can purchase smartphones. I may sound very revolutionary right now, but when it comes to children or other marginalized communities, I think that we become a little bit more judgmental and worry too much, have hyper concerns about protection, privacy, and that's okay, that's normal, because most of the time when I give speech about my topic, people say, well, yeah, you think that's bad, right? That parents are posting their children's photos. And I say, well, I don't know, because it seems like parents are taking advantage of it. As long as they talk to the child and explain them what's happening, I don't see a problem. I show Sally Mann's famous naked photo of her child, and she has this amazing New York Times piece that she wrote. Well, I talked to my children about this, and we spoke, and it helped them get educated about publicity and privacy and their rights. And I think that what's missing most of the adult conversations that we don't speak about, do you know your privacy rights? Do you know where this photo is going? Do you know how this photo may end up in a completely different place? Most of the time people don't know. But that's my 2 cents there.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your papers. This was fascinating just to see the through line of projecting aspirations and dismantling male gaze and how that arose out of this history of re-examining the self. So building on all of that, I'm curious, and this is more perceptual, I think, maybe than things you researched. Do you feel like these ad hoc hashtag communities with fashion or parents as aspirational have do they encourage evolving, evolution of fashion and norms and representation, or do they tend to be more self-policing, or is it some of both? I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as I said, they're definitely based on self-interest.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think that they have any concerns whatsoever about if their children are going to being represented this way. But if I ask everyone the question, what's your favorite childhood photo, everyone can think and find one, right? And that very much influences our identities, our behavior, about how we represent ourselves to the world. So there's a self-interest definitely from the angle of parents or person who's doing the posting. But I also have to always say, well, every parent have their best of their children in their heart, right? They don't want to necessarily harm them. So yeah, definitely it seems like a selfish act. But more research needs to be done following up on these children, especially influencer children. They're like children who are making millions of dollars, and that is a child labor issue too, right? So as babies, these babies are making money, and they're taking advantage in one angle, but we don't know where that money goes to. So yeah, there's definitely a need for more research following up on children and parents and how they end up. There's an amazing documentary called The Marina Experiment. This woman who had a photographer father who documented all of her childhood, and she made this 15-minute amazing short film based on these small footages and recordings, and how disturbed she was at the end because she thought that this was a child abuse. So I highly recommend it. So that's an example that happened in the 80s, but I don't know if in 2020s we will see more documentaries of children or adolescents and just telling their parents, like, why did you do this? Like, why did you document all my life? Because I cannot get into college because you posted photos of me doing such and such. Or like there may be transgender that they may not have any interesting photos of themselves as like women or like men, you know? So there are so many implications that definitely needs to be researched, yeah.
Rachel, I know you wanted to quickly jump in. We're almost out of time, but if you want to respond to that.
I think there's the really interesting thing that how long do we have to wait to look back on something to know whether it was good or bad? And I think that's a really urgent problem of now, that sometimes at the moment I think we maybe have to guess, because if we leave it for 5 years, then who knows?
Right. Yeah.
I think that wraps up our panel today, so please give a round of applause to our panelists. And again, we missed Anja, but we hope she'll be back next year, so thank you.